Hey everybody, and welcome to Project Move. Thanks for joining us. And today we're gonna actually kind of talk about Project Move and kind of how this all got started, and just give you kind of talk to you, a little bit about what it means to us. My name is Matt Trimarke. I own a CrossFit gym. I've been in the fitness industry for over 15 years now, and really just kind of tried to, just with who I am, I've always tried to try to learn more and understand more. And yeah, I kind of feel like I've done this past 15 years, very slow process of it, but just trying to slowly learn a little bit more each year. And along the way, met this guy, Dr. Josh Wideman. And Josh, why don't you give yourself a little intro?
Yep. So chiropractor by trade. I probably focus a little bit more on the rehab side of things than more of the soft tissue manual therapy side of things. But I'm trying to bridge the gap between kind of like the clinic and the gym, kind of melding of the two, if you will. So I think that's where we both kind of like see ourselves, if you will, trying to kind of improve the human condition to be able to allow people to do what they want to do for as long as they want, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of our kind of continuing education has overlapped, and we kind of share a lot of similar philosophies. And what we kind of found along the way is that our current training system is just a little outdated. I'm not saying things are wrong, but we do know more now, and it just really isn't kind of talked about. And so, kind of that's kind of what we're here to do, is just to share more information. Hopefully, you find it helpful. Take it or leave it, but I believe the science kind of holds up, and the results show for themselves, speak for
Yeah,
themselves.
I think, everyone knows diet, exercise, but most people don't understand like what that entails, right? So, they might go to the gym 3 times a week, but it's they're on the treadmill, like they're not really doing anything specific, right? And I think we've talked a lot about being specific, and not that you have to be specific for everything, but I think whenever people find themselves not making the progress that they want, there's probably a level of detail that they're probably lacking, right?
Definitely. Um, yeah. So, Project Move. Uh, Basically, the idea of movement is the first one. It's essential for life, optimization, variability, and education. And part of really making changes and improving our clients' long-term health, short-term health, and really just getting progress kind of involves a little bit of that education process.
Yeah, you got to know kind of the why behind the what. You got to know why you're doing what you're doing. So whenever you know better, you do better. So it's one of those things that if we can create a little bit of an educational platform and maybe upgrade your knowledge just a little bit, I think that once you kind of see it differently, you'll start to appreciate why we're maybe approaching things at the way that we're doing.
Yeah. All right, so let's start from the beginning. Movement. It's a biological imperative, and
Yep.
our bodies are actually designed to move.
Hmm.
So we can kind of maybe let's kind of start and like just kind of like from like a embryonic development. Like we can kind of talk about the meso, ecto, and endoderm, and basically what it is like our nervous system forms first,
Right.
that ectoderm, and then literally our endoderm, or sorry, our mesoderm forms around that and allows our neurology to kind of interact with the world.
Correct. So imagine kind of like, central nervous system, which would be our spinal cord and brain, peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves that go out to the arms and legs. That is kind of our true core, if you will, and everything else kind of is how we interact with the world. So because it's deep within inside us, we don't really have any true connection with the outside world except through how we move and how we interact. And so because of that, we can't just be in a chair all day. Like our nervous system would really starve, if you will. So we need to be out interacting with the world. And how we do that is through our musculoskeletal system. But if we didn't have the ability to move, we really wouldn't need our nervous system in the first place.
Yeah, and so much how we developed and how we got here uh, was basically our body just or slowly adapting and being able to kind of solve complex problems.
Yeah, you can. I mean, the whole like dynamic systems theory and how, like, whenever you're a baby, we're born with endless amounts of range of motion. I mean, you can kind of take their legs and arms and kind of move them all around. And so, because we have so much variability, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but because of that, we had to learn how to kind of decrease options to kind of make the best decision for the tissues and joints that we have. And, if you think of how we develop, doesn't matter where a human is, you could be at all ends of the earth and we all develop in a relatively similar way. Um, and it's interesting because even though there might be slight environmental differences, the body kind of figures out this is the best way for the anatomy that we have. Like this is the best option.
Yeah, and if you think about just from a development, like movement's kind of the first thing our body tries to solve first, like
Correct.
versus over language, over trying to solve speaking any sort of complex problems. Our body's really just trying to work out how to orient itself in space, and that's I mean, it's part of the reason why like so much of our brain resources should be and is allocated for movement.
Yeah, so if you look at basically from months 0 to 14, the goal is to become upright. So between that 12 and 14 months, that's whenever the baby's fully able to be upright. And so there's stages that the baby will go through, and they're not fixed in stone. There's ranges, but we know that at 3 months they should be doing these particular things. At 6 months they should be doing these particular things. And it's one of those things that the goal is to gradually kind of move through those stages. And at each stage, they're becoming a little bit more complex in their movement path, if you will.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit on like why this concept about movement, how it's essential for life,
Right.
and just through like cellular transport and repair. Maybe it's
Mm-hmm,
kind of briefly
mm-hmm.
kind of touch on that.
Yeah. So imagine, if you had the analogy of like a river, right? And the river's flowing, and you have a storm, and there's some trees and limbs, and eventually the river kind of builds this dam, if you will. And so the river like doesn't flow as well as it used to, right? And so there could be some stagnation. So there's maybe some pooling. Long story short, movement is essential for how we move fluid throughout the body. And so, like we've talked about in previous episodes about lymphatic flow, and the lymphatic system is a passive system. So if we don't have movement, the lymphatics will become stagnant. Um, that's just one example. And so our bodies really are craving movement to allow some of these cellular processes to really happen.
Yeah, and also don't want to forget this one. The way our body communicates, it's through force. Our
Mm-hmm,
cells
mm-hmm.
speak together through force.
Right.
Let's kind of give maybe a brief kind of maybe explanation of of that.
Yeah. So force is the language of cells. So all the way down to like the DNA level, like DNA codes for proteins, but proteins are now like the building blocks of our tissues, but then they also respond to force. And so if you don't put a force through the tissue will eventually atrophy. So, whenever we look at astronauts going up into space, we see that immediately calcium starts to kind of leach from the bones. We see bone density goes down. We see that muscular tissue starts to break down. We see connective tissue start, like, we don't need the force absorption or force creation capacity because the microgravity, or basically zero gravity. So long story short, because we're in a gravitational field, we need to be able to overcome gravity, and we need to be able to kind of move around. And so because of that, we have to be able to produce force, but force is really the driving mechanism behind how we maintain the health of our tissues.
Yeah. And if we're not using it, we're losing it. So, I mean, yeah, if, like Josh was saying, if we're not using our as much of our range of motion as we're kind of we're born with, we're just going to eventually lose it. Uh, yeah, let's kind of maybe talk about this thing that like how everybody's an athlete in a sense. So I guess the idea with everybody's an athlete is that we all have our goals and our sport in life.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us may play professional baseball. Others may be a stay-at-home mom for 4 kids.
Right.
We all have tissue requirements for what is it we do in our everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to vary dramatically person to person, and that's why specifics matter. But yeah, let's maybe kind of talk about maybe the specifics of movement from a different type of from person to person.
Yeah, so I think, if you're the stay-at-home mom, or maybe not what you would consider your typical prototype of an athlete, right? You might not see training or specific training as valuable. So the interesting thing is the body has these redundancies, and so sometimes you don't even realize you're losing capacity until it's too late. And so it's one of those things that, if you're a mom and you've got a couple of kids, and you've got to be able to pick them up, and obviously whenever they're young, they're small, it's maybe less of an issue. But as they get older and you're putting them in car seats and getting them in and out of different things, like, it requires a certain amount of physicality. And so not that we need to be a power lifter or anything along those lines, but we do need certain physical capacities. So, if you're already used to training, or you're used to kind of moving through space, it's one of those things that it's just natural to be able to. But sometimes, that stay-at-home mom, they don't see themselves as an athlete, so they think that they need to do yoga or maybe some less intense activities, and then that might be the person who might have this chronic back pain that they don't understand why every time they lift their child out of the crib, that they don't have the capacity to do that on a consistent basis. So I think that kind of reframing the idea that, we all need a level of physicality, we just have to determine what that winds up being. And so if we view the stay-at-home mom, or even if you're a photographer, it doesn't matter. Like, you need a certain level of capacity, and if you don't have that capacity, like we've talked about in other episodes, you're asking yourself for potential injury, right?
Yeah, and kind of speaking to this differences between, like, people to people, we all have to have some sort of movement in our lives, and it's basically built into at least our like neurochemistry. Like, it's our bodies are actually rewarded for movement, and we're actually going to kind of go into this into a later podcast more in depth. But if we're not moving, we're not kind of getting these like positive feedback loops. We're not getting all these neurochemicals, and we can actually start to see cognitive decline and a lot of downstream effects from just lack of movement.
Yeah, so if you think of, like, what were we naturally selected for, and we're we're hunter-gatherers, even though it's 2025. Our DNA doesn't really know the difference. And so the genome really is very similar. So because of that hunter-gatherer lifestyle, we're now buying our food at a grocery store, but we should be every morning going out to do something along those lines. So that again would be a movement requirement, right? And so then if we asked ourselves, what are we doing? And most people aren't going to, gather water or do those things. And then you asked yourself, what are you doing to counteract the fact that you're not doing what you're actually designed for? And so if we kind of reframe movement from that sense, it's like the reason why we have to have a gym is because we have to artificially create exercises and movements because we don't do the things that we were designed to do in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that kind of starts to segue us into now optimization.
Yep.
Being a little bit more precise in our prescriptions. And yeah, I think to kind of start that, we need to talk a little bit about kind of how movement happens and why we do certain exercises. I think this kind of often gets overlooked, but when we do an exercise, whatever our goal is, it comes from our internal environment. So like in order to do a bench press, in order to, pick our kids up and put them in their booster seat, it's based off the anatomy we have.
Correct.
And it all happens internally. So no matter what our exercise is, we have to realize that it's coming from the inside.
Yeah, and if you think about back to kind of that original example about the ectoderm, right? The sensory system is central to our self, right? And so our body kind of sees ourself from the inside out. And so because of that, that's the exact way that the movement is created. It's kind of from it's interacting with the environment. So we have to kind of figure out what we're going to do, but then the way that the movement is initiated is kind of from the deepest tissue out to the more superficial tissue. And so if there's a joint restriction or a tissue restriction, like that's going to actually prevent us from moving before the constraints of the movement itself. So, if we put someone into, say, a bench press or some external movement, and we say we want it done a very particular way, if their anatomy doesn't have the ability to get into that position, we're setting them up for a potential problem, because we're now confining the variables because we like it that particular way. But if we take a step back and we actually assess or we determine what their anatomy has the ability to do, we then can select better exercises for that individual.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that's, at least from a training program, most people aren't really assessing kind of where they're at. They just kind of see, I want to have a bigger chest, so I need to do bench press. But you really need to think, and then people think, bench press gives me more anatomy. They don't really think of it as like, my anatomy allows me to do a bench press.
Yeah, because the bench press isn't for your shoulder or for your chest. You need your chest to be able to do a bench press. Same thing with like a squat. A squat is not for your hip. You need your hip to be able to do a squat. And if someone's saying, I need you to go lower, your hip has to be able to get you there, not just put more weight on the bar to force you into the position.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. And then pretty much all of this training that we kind of see in the gym, these external displays of, force, are just a internal expression.
And it's an internal expression, it's an external display of the internal expression of movement. Yes.
Yes. So yeah, like assessing the tissue is going to be very important. Kind of knowing where we're at, and then being able to figure out where we're deficient at, but also where we're actually safe to train in. Because if we don't have a certain range of motion, in order to do that external display of whatever that exercise may be, we're going to end up compensating elsewhere into a tissue that wasn't necessarily designed to do that. So let's take that overhead shoulder press. If you
Mm-hmm.
don't have the internal capabilities of going into 180 degrees of shoulder flexion,
Right.
you're going to compensate a lot now that low back. So now you're asking, whenever every time you go overhead and do to a shoulder press, you're now asking your shoulder, but also your low back to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like we said earlier, your low back's not really meant to do that.
Correct.
And to do that over and over and over again. You may be fine. You may be able to get away with it indefinitely. But there may be a point in time when the load that you're putting into that back exceeds the capacity of that back, and it's ultimately going to injure. So it may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, it may not happen a month from now, but ultimately we're just trying to decrease the likelihood and bring the math more in our favor.
Yeah, and this is a completely kind of tangent, and we potentially will have another episode, I think, on back pain. But if you think if you're constantly like going into extension to get your arm overhead, and then you're going into these repeated kind of extension movements, if you think of how a disc delaminates. So long story.
I think about that all the time, Josh.
Yeah. So if you think of the way that a disc is not like one material. It's like these concentric rings that are like stacked on top of each other. And so the disc internal material, the nucleus, it's non-compressible. So whenever you go into that extension and you're forcing that nucleus, if it's a healthy disc and it's contained, there's no issues. But if you over time, if you're kind of like think of a paperclip, and you kind of go back and forth a few times, it's fine. But if you keep going, eventually it's going to break. Well, that is going to be the same thing that happens with. And so you might not get a disc herniation first time, second time, third time, but after years of training a particular way, those collagen fibers start to kind of unwind a little bit, and then eventually that nucleus gets forced and we start to see downstream effects. So all I'm saying is that the particular way you're moving has consequences. And I think to take a step back on this whole optimization talk. So optimization sounds like we're being very specific, and yes, that is true, but we have to know the goals in the first place, right? If you say you just want to be healthy, that's a different conversation than I want to compete in a powerlifting match or I want to compete in a CrossFit competition. Like, we need to kind of know what your goals are. And if it's just to be generally healthy, go back to the longevity episode, and you have to now be a very good at like partitioning your time and working at a bunch of different things. It's not just one thing. So knowing what the goals are helps kind of funnel our energy in the right direction, so you're not spinning your wheels doing things that don't matter.
Yeah. So yeah, kind of getting kind of back into this optimization and kind of tailoring specific exercises and programs to whatever it is our goals are.
Mm-hmm.
We got to need. I guess we have to have some sort of understanding of that each tissue has specific force profiles, and it's not just going to come from just moving a weight up and down. We now know that tissues respond to forces in different ways, and certain types of tissues are like, before we never really knew connective tissue really existed or was actually a trainable quality. Now we actually know how to put load into tissue in order to bias more connective tissue.
Yeah, I think this is a I mean, we've talked about it several times
Oh yeah.
before, but I think this is kind of the crux of the problem because everyone wants to know what exercise. And it's like, well, it might not be a named exercise. Um, and the challenge is not all connective tissue responds the same. And tendon in different places is going to respond differently because different loads are being put through it. So every tissue has its own force profile. And even though it might be a similar tissue to a different area, because it's a different area, it has its own force profile because of where it's located. And so if we're talking muscle, we can talk about, just the general fast twitch versus slow twitch. And then we can talk about, the load bearing capacity. We can talk about like the springiness of the connective tissue. I mean, we can get pretty deep, but if we're not taking it to that level, we're really not training the tissue at the level that it could be trained. And so, if we're just talking about general health, again, it's okay. But really what we're talking about here is trying to squeeze out potential, right? And if we're trying to squeeze out potential, we need to be taking a little bit more of a kind of a nuanced approach.
Yeah, and we kind of talked before, but like if you're relatively new to working out, like yeah, just doing whatever is you're going to see results. And as you, if you're looking for more general health and you've been working out for a while and maybe always seeing progress isn't necessarily that important for whatever it is your lifestyle is. But if you are somebody who is struggling, then yeah, we really do need to kind of start understanding these concepts of how different tissues have different force profiles. And like you said, kind of everybody's kind of looking for what exercises we need to do, but like maybe more importantly to think is like uh, what's the intensity, what's the time duration, and what's the directionality it's going in. And that's
Mm-hmm.
certain thing about it that way versus certain exercises, I think is gonna kind of break that stagnation and
Right.
allow us to keep continued
Well,
progress.
yeah, that's another thing. So all tissues have specific directionality. So if you think of linear motion, well, if the tissue isn't moving in that specific line, you're probably not activating it to the same extent. So if we look at different tissues, there's going to be these different fiber directions, and we have to move in that fiber direction to truly stimulate change in that tissue.
Yeah, and another thing, like just throwing it up, open versus closed chain, which really kind of nobody talks about. Like we can bias more connective tissue, essentially, if we want to develop more by doing typically more open chain exercises,
Right.
training at length
Mm-hmm.
isometrically,
Mm-hmm.
and then also to length.
Right.
So specifics do matter, and that's kind of this kind of ties into that optimization. Is like how do we get exactly what it is we want
Yeah, and I think
or what we need.
to just kind of like I 100% agree with that. But sometimes I think people can get lost in the weeds and they're trying to over optimize before they even kind of have the basics. And so, you know, I saw this the other day. I saw someone they were looking at like different collagen proteins or whatever, and it's like I don't. This person didn't look that healthy, and so it was one of those things. It's like I don't know if collagen protein is going to be the answer for your particular problem. I think just starting to kind of get a general level of fitness is going to probably be the starting point. So I think that it
Very true.
depends on where you're at in your health journey. It really depends on like what we need to kind of be focusing on or talking about. But even with that person who needs to be starting kind of at the basic level, not getting lost in the weeds of too many details, they still need specifics for their particular body. So it doesn't mean that we just throw the baby out with the bathwater and you just kind of do 3 sets of 10. Like
Yeah.
it it's a little bit more nuanced, but at the same time, um, we have to take that individualized approach to be able to kind of meet the needs of the person in front of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And whenever we try to optimize for specifics, I mean, everything comes at a trade-off. We only have a finite amount of resources and
Right.
energy.
Yeah.
So knowing where we dump that into is going to matter. So if we're a professional athlete,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to have to spend a little bit more time focusing on training the tissues that's going to make us better at our external display of our sport,
Right. Right.
and that's going to come at a cost.
Correct.
I mean, when we look at retired athletes all the time, we see you know several underlying issues with joint health just because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they had to compromise and it came at a trade-off to where now, like, in order to be a professional athlete, it's maybe not going to be the best for our long-term health.
Right.
uh, so yeah, we can't be kind of world class at everything. Everything's going to come at a trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just overall health, then yeah, maybe you can then you're kind of maybe going down more that longevity path.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this in our kind of performance, but it's like the cost of performance is your health. So whenever we see these professional athletes, they're teetering on the edge of like catastrophe. Like they're not the healthiest. We look at marathon runners. Just because they can run long distances doesn't necessarily mean that they're the healthiest. Triathletes, just because they can do 3 different endurance sports doesn't mean they're the healthiest. Power lifters, just because they can lift a ton of weight doesn't mean they're the healthiest person. So I don't think we should look to some of these sports and say, because they can do these feats of strength or feats of endurance, that's what we should be optimizing for quote unquote health.
Yeah, and
It's tough to, because you think, okay, this guy can run 26 miles. It's like, oh, that's a pretty cool feat, but it's like that doesn't necessarily mean that person has the best knees or the best back or whatever.
what you may see online that somebody's doing for their workout may make them better at what it is they're trying to do.
Yeah.
But because maybe you play the same sport as that person, you have a different biology than them.
Mm-hmm.
So what's right for them may not be, it may be the complete wrong thing for you. Like, they may have great stiffness in their connective tissue and
Right.
are able to transmit and absorb force
Mm-hmm.
very well, whereas you may have maybe a lot more musculature and have a lot more red tissue, but you're just bleeding out energy. And yeah, so knowing where you're at, what your goals are, we can really optimize your training accordingly.
Yeah, and I just think that getting back to the individuality, like so like if you look at Instagram or anything online, you don't know what their particular movement history is. You don't know what their capabilities are, and that kind of gets back to the original discussion of that internal environment. Their internal environment is going to be completely different than yours. So you could be doing the same exercise, but your body's going to see that exercise differently as the other person. And so a deadlift may be good for you, but we might need to change the position so that this other person gets the benefits, because their anatomy might be limited in a particular way.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of with that, maybe like this, the switching of exercises, kind of brings us into like variability and why variability is going to be important in our training.
Mm-hmm.
Just because if we're kind of doing the same thing over again, our body's going to adapt specifically to what it is we put it through, and it's going to get really good at that. But as soon as we get outside of that, we're opening ourselves up to an increased likelihood of injury.
Yeah, so I think we've talked about this previously, but there is a difference between variability and variety. So I think variety gets misused in place of variability. So most people think that, oh, I'm going to just change the exercise, and that's variety of movement, not necessarily variability in movement. So whenever we're talking about variability, this kind of goes back again to that original discussion that we talked about with the baby. So the dynamic systems of how the joints work, the goal is we want the joint to have as many movement options as possible, and then we self-select for the best option for the task at hand. So we've talked about accommodation previously. And so if you are a power lifter and you do a block of max effort squatting, your joint workspace for the hip is going to accommodate very specifically and narrowly to the squat that you're performing. And you're going to actually limit workspace. So now your variability is actually compressing to just do the squat that particular way. Whereas if we can maintain as much variability as possible, we can be in maybe a little bit of a different foot position and still be able to perform the movement with high amounts of skill and force. Whereas a lot of times people, they get very confined to only being able to do the move one particular way. And then whenever they go out and play their sport isn't as neatly,
Organized, yeah.
And so it just leads to potential problems down the road.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into kind of what we talked about before as far as just maintaining our joints workspace. So if we can maintain as much range of motion or movement capabilities in that joint, we essentially have more access and more biology to kind of tap into.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the key to kind of, preventing accommodation. So like taxing different lines of tissue essentially keeps our body from confining to specific ranges of motion, and we're able to kind of not only like in our sport tap into more force producing tissue when things aren't going as neatly as maybe we liked,
Mm-hmm.
But then that allows us from as a trainable concept get more biology and kind of then preventing stagnation in our training.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter what sport or what pattern exercise we're doing, it is a pattern, if you will. So, we talk about like squat, hinge, like those types of patterns in the gym. Whether it be throwing a baseball, hitting a golf ball, it's a pattern. And so part of what we're talking about is almost like depatternizing and allowing for as many movement options as possible, so that whenever we kind of get out onto the field of play, the body has the opportunity to choose the best pattern.
Yeah, and then also kind of getting onto it kind of makes me think about like by having more variability in our ranges of motion and exercises, it allows us from a neurological standpoint to kind of like we have more familiarity with that zone of training,
Mm-hmm.
so we're able to kind of tap into it that much easier,
Mm-hmm.
which is also decrease injury, but just make us more comfortable and also be able to perform. Because if you're whatever your sport is, if you're essentially trying to, from a biology standpoint, try to get as much biology into the constraints of, I guess, your sport.
Mm-hmm.
In order to do that, it's like you need your neurology to be able to tap into as much biology as possible.
Yep.
So having more access to more tissue essentially will then also then kind of raise our threshold as far as our like neurological kind of cap.
Yeah, so the neurological system is basically the gatekeeper of range of motion or our movement. So if the joint has the freedom the neurology is going to be able to connect with all those different tissues. But if for whatever reason, if it's a painful joint, or if there's an injury, or for whatever reason the joint feels threatened, if you will, there's going to be this confining of the range of motion. And so originally that's going to be under neurological control, but over time, if nothing changes, the biology will adapt to that confined workspace, if you will. And so, again, we've probably talked about this previously, but like that tissue is going to be no longer utilized to its fullest extent. So the body basically says, let's wall it off. Let's create a less expensive tissue to maintain. And so again, that starts confining the workspace and limiting range of motion. So the better we can maintain that workspace, the better connection we're going to have with the surrounding biology, which then allows us to be able to utilize that with whatever exercise or pattern or task that we choose to use.
And from a training perspective, our bodies are inherently lazy. So if we're only using certain range of motion, if we only squat in the exact same way, our bodies are confined. We're going to have less tissue options. Because our bodies are inherently lazy, we're going to conserve as many calories as we have, because having good quality force absorbing tissue is it costs.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can create more variability, keep more good quality tissue, just from like an exercise standpoint, we're going to be able to like just burn more calories throughout the day. And we're just going to essentially, in our fitness goals, from if we're trying to have some sort of aesthetic look, or we're trying to maybe even trying to lose weight, if we have more biology to access to, we're essentially going to, from like I said, an exercise standpoint, be able to burn more calories and see results there.
Yeah, so that, I mean, going back to the very beginning, we talked about cellular health. So if we can have that neurological connection and we can tap into more of those tissues, we're going to maintain the health of those tissues, and then we're going to be able to utilize those tissues to then expend calories, to maybe lose weight, or to maybe, like you said, pack on size to gain a particular look, or to help us in our particular sport to produce more force, to hit the ball farther, or whatever the task may be.
Yeah. Variability.
I mean, I think we kind of talked about like the articular health is kind of the essence, and then it kind of like the body sees itself from the inside out. So if you're unable to access that particular tissue, you're gonna, like, it doesn't matter what your coach says about squatting deeper or whatever. If you don't have access to it, you can't move, or you can't move. So forcing yourself to try to get into that position is eventually going to lead to a particular problem. So I think that kind of going back to that assessment, making sure that you're kind of moving within your capabilities, and then gradually trying to kind of expand, if you will. I think that's kind of where we're trying to go with this a bit.
Yeah. Okay, education. So yeah, like we kind of mentioned before, like part of maintaining progress and really getting results, there has to be, at least from being on the professional side, working with clients, there has to be some sort of education and knowledge passed along to them in order for them to really kind of keep the results coming. I mean, there's some clients, who come in, 3, 4, 5 times a week, and you can kind of maybe get away with that more. But if you're kind of on your own, like more education has to happen. You're going to have to kind of learn to do things on your own, because, moving 4 times a week for 1 hour really is just not sufficient, especially with the world we live in today, because we're so confined to being stationary whenever we're not actually working out. We're behind desks, we're underneath artificial lights.
You know,
Uh, yeah, so like part of this process is just kind of informing our clients and informing members just I guess how important movement is and things we can do to prevent injury and help progress along the way.
yeah, I think there's, if we're talking like signal to noise, right? I think there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of people selling their hack. So I think if we can create this educational background that like why we're choosing specific exercises or movements, I think it's important. But I think also it kind of like demystifies like why certain things work and why certain things don't work. But I think a lot of people, they're just they're searching for the next thing, right? And so they're not really taking a systematic approach, and they're just like, oh well, this exercise looks cool, well, I'm going to go try it. Well, it's like, well, it might be fun, but is it actually benefiting you? Probably not. And so I think that part of what we're trying to accomplish is just a little bit more informed whenever you're looking at certain things on social media or YouTube or whatever, that you're coming at it from a little bit more of a, okay, I can see why someone would want to be doing this particular exercise, and not just approaching it from, oh, that looks cool, or he lifted a lot of weight.
Yeah. Yeah, because like we said earlier, what might be right for one person might not be, or might be the complete wrong thing for another person.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of myth busting, or like the information that might have been prevalent 10, 20 years ago, and it might not have been wrong, but it might not have been the best. People kind of like hold on to like the information that they learned first. And so sometimes it's difficult to unlearn the old information so that you can kind of update your knowledge base, if you will. So I think the part of the process of what we're trying to do here is also maybe do a little bit of myth busting, and kind of show, hey, even though someone might have got a result with this particular philosophy, there's maybe some reasons of why this isn't the best, now that we know better.
Yeah. And I feel like part of what comes along with the education is now that there's a certain level of awareness in a client or individual, uh, it kind of makes their actions a little bit maybe more intentional, and like maybe they'll think twice about maybe like, oh, I've been sitting at a desk for a couple hours, I need to kind of get up and show my joints some love.
Yeah, I think, we've been conditioned to be a passive recipient for our health, if you will. So, like, you go to the doctor is the so called expert. They say, you need this. And then you just say, oh, okay. And then you just do it. We need to be kind of like the CEO of our own body, if you will. And so, if we can be a little bit more informed, and so you can be a little bit more educated on whenever your doctor says, oh, I think this is going to be a good option, then you can be like, well, what about this? And not just reciting the pharmaceutical commercial that you saw last night while you were watching TV. More of a in-depth conversation of, hey, these are like the new research papers that are coming out on connective tissue health. Why aren't you suggesting some of these things? I think that we really need to have that level of detail, because otherwise you're just going to kind of go along with the same old, whatever.
Yeah, and our body's going to pay the price for that.
Yeah.
I looked up a statistic the other day just for my curiosity. The amount of joint replacements that from like 2023 from like the early 2000s has gone up like tenfold.
Oh yeah, no, it's surprising, and it's like, okay, I think the common wisdom now is like, we can just do whatever we want, and oh, we can just replace it, rather than saying we have one body, let's treat it with respect, and let's try to maintain the natural state of our body as long as possible. I think, you know, even though we've had several advancements in orthopedic surgery, I think the common wisdom is like, oh, I'll just get a knee replacement or I'll just get a hip replacement. Like, because if you talk to, your neighbor, or you talk to, someone down the street, it's like, oh yeah, I had a hip replacement. It was the best thing I did. It's like, well, why did you need the hip replacement in the first place? Because that's not normal, even though we've made it normal.
Yeah. And I think part of the education comes with uh, just kind of educating our bodies in space. And part of this comes along with is by doing this and putting our bodies through, more of these like in range motions and really bringing intentionality into our
Mm-hmm.
workouts.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us more of awareness of like when things are kind of going to be going wrong in our body, and we can then therefore be a little bit more proactive uh, in our approach to treatment.
Yeah, I think that the proactive component is missing in a lot of people's kind of philosophy, but I think that's a huge piece, because if you're going through kind of your daily movement practice and you start to feel stiff in a particular area, that's a warning sign. It doesn't just mean, oh, I need to stretch more. It's like, oh, there's a reason why you're feeling stiff today. Rather, it's like, what did you do yesterday? Um, you know, I went to the driving range and I hit a big, large bucket of golf balls. Like, now my right hip is giving me some, problems. It's like, okay, well, maybe you needed to do a little bit more of a thorough warm up instead of just going out and beating a bunch of balls. Uh, that's just an example, but I think being a little bit more aware of, again, back to that intentionality, and then using that information to then target our training, I think can be beneficial. Or if you're working with someone, hey Matt, I went to the range yesterday and my right hip's been giving me some trouble. You're going to now be able to tailor the warm up and the specific exercises to be able to kind of like tap into some of those things that we've talked about earlier.
Yeah, and yeah, I think along with this education, like I said, it's gonna bring more awareness to our body, and then we get like we've mentioned before, we get all these other downstream effects, like mental health. We'll see all of our biomarkers improve, and
Mm-hmm.
I think whether you're working out by yourself, seeking out some sort of education, trying to get a little bit more understanding of how our body works, because it's literally why we're here,
Mm-hmm.
is for movement, or seeking a professional who's you know has the knowledge and has the education to kind of answer a more in-depth questions. It's like, why am I doing 3 sets of 10 on the bench press when I'm a 6-year-old male who sits behind a desk all day typing at a computer?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that
I mean, maybe you wanted an aesthetic, bigger looking chest, but do you want a torn rotator cuff? Do you want a shoulder replacement? I mean, like, if you're working with a fitness professional, I would say just see how many layers of questions you can answer,
mhm.
or they can answer, and yeah, if not, like, just I say don't settle, and be more proactive in taking your health, your physical health, uh, more seriously.
Yeah, I think trainers are almost like the front lines, if you will. So you're probably going to interact with your clients on a more frequent basis than the typical healthcare professional. But you can be proactive in your training and changing exercises and changing positions. But if you keep running into the same problem over and over again, I think that's where consulting with healthcare professional that has more of this maybe rehab active first approach, because they're going to be able to create not necessarily a medical diagnosis, but they're going to be able to diagnose the situation and target the problem a little bit more precisely than just general exercise. So then that's where having a bit of a team where, you know, you look at all the best athletes, they all have their team, right? And so the right person steps up whenever they need to be the leader, if you will. And so I think the average person should have a bit of a team. Not that you need them all the time, but the trainer is kind of the front lines, like I said, and you're going to be kind of the person that they see most often. But if something starts to crop up, having that proactive, hey, let's get a checkup, let's make sure that that right hip or that left shoulder is fine, and then that gives you confidence, because I think a lot of times whenever something is painful or something just doesn't feel right, the kind of the fear is that I'm making it worse, right?
Yeah.
And so if we can kind of quell the fear of tissue damage or whatever, I think then we can get you back into training at the level that you want to be anyway. And so instead of like letting it fester to the point where now we need a more serious intervention, we can kind of stave that off to the point where you're back to training and there's really no limitations.
Yeah, there's always something that says like, even with clients who I see, multiple times a week, it's like sometimes people are afraid to kind of find out, like, and get issues kind of checked out.
Oh yeah.
So it's just kind of
there's a safety in not knowing, if you will, because like, oh, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. But once you know, then it's like, and just because you get a diagnosis of rotator cuff tear or meniscal tear, like that doesn't necessarily mean that surgery is the best option at the moment. And again, I think we're going to do another episode on like when surgery is appropriate versus when we probably should be looking elsewhere. So I think that we'll save that for later. But I think that having that conversation is really important, because it's happening on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Yeah. So once again, Project M.O.V.E, movement optimization, variability education. I think both Josh and I just kind of have a passion for just trying to improve people's lives through movement and whatever else we can help on, and we both like are always trying to learn more. Yeah. So yeah. If you liked everything, I think please share. Also, yeah, if there's anything you'd be interested in learning more about, feel free to drop us a comment, and maybe do an episode on that.
Sounds good. I think that that sums it up pretty good.
All right. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.